Please help me to welcome Lily. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here. Honestly, it's been a while since I've been able to be in Iowa. The schedules seem to never kind of quite match up. This is a topic, the future of funeral service, that resonates deeply with me for multiple reasons. I will start off with that, yes, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I'm a licensed funeral director, licensed embalmer, licensed attorney. I run one of the oldest and largest mortuary science programs in the country. So I see about 20% of all the funeral directors that come through the country on an annual basis. In addition to that, my husband and I also own a funeral home as well too. So I kind of get to see both sides of it, where I can look at the students coming in and go, it's going to be a long road. It's going to be a long road. And at the other side of it, I can also look and go, this is a long road to get you where you need to be as an employee as well too. So I kind of can see both sides of it and kind of understand your position kind of as funeral directors that are out there that are looking for, where's the next great talent? What do we do and how do we start to shape this so that we can really preserve this profession for the next generation? Some of the things that we'll talk about today are kind of looking at the demographics and kind of the data of who our new students are, because I think it's really important to inform that discussion and to start off with some data. The American Board of Funeral Service Education, for about 4 years, I was the chair of that committee. Every year, what they do is they survey all 58 mortuary science programs, and from that, data is collected. And those are kind of the data that about who is going to school, retention issues, all those different things. So I'm going to share some of that data and look at it from both 2023 and 2024. So we'll get started together right here. I promise not a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but I want to start off with a kind of what our national pipeline looked like in 2024. The 2025 numbers are just being finalized at our annual meeting, which is I'm leaving from here and going directly over there. So we'll be getting those numbers for 2025. If we look at 2023 and 2024, our new enrollees started at about 3,072 and then moved up to in 2024, 3,363. When we look at the number of graduates, we actually graduated in 2023, 1,912 students, and in 2024, 2,016. I want to speak to this because that is nationally. So that means across all 58 mortuary science programs, you saw it last year, 2,016 graduates for the entire country. You'll also see where our current enrollment stands, where you see that's about 6,900 to about 7,100 that's right now. And you'll see where the enrollment is a little bit different because most mortuary science programs are approximately 2 years. So you'll see where those new enrollees come in and then become graduates can kind of span anywhere between about a 2-year mark. So that's where you're starting to see why our current enrollment looks like a lot higher than the number of graduates actually coming out. So I think what the takeaways from this type of data are is that it's not so much a lack of interest. We have people that are interested in funeral service and they are coming to school. This number has been fairly consistent for the last 20 years. And we also see that growth is actually strongest at the front end of that pipeline. So that means the students are enrolling, they're finding mortuary science and they're coming in. The interesting question I think that we need to really spend the time on is what happens after they come, right? What happens after they get into mortuary school? And then what happens after they leave mortuary school? So the way I would look at this is that recruitment appears healthier than the retention sometimes suggests, because I think what we see is the end result going, where are the people? How can I hire them? Where are they? And that can feel very frustrating, especially depending on your community. When you look at that nationally and thinking about the 2016, that's not a lot of people. I also want to share a statistic. I was able to partner with Light Source Data. I'm also finishing up my dissertation with Johns Hopkins this upcoming year, and I'm looking specifically at workforce and retention. Some of the data that we were able to pull is that, and I find this number almost staggering, is that 55% of our funeral directors nationally are age 60 or older. When we start to think about that number and you start to think about the number of students coming in, we really do have an issue. And it's not something we can't solve, but it's something that we all actually have to work together. That's why I think the theme of this convention, everything that we're doing really does matter, because when we look at that, there is a cliff and that cliff is coming. And we all have to work together to kind of save that. So again, that number, when you think about that, 55% of our funeral directors are 60 or older. That is a shocking number. So let's move on. We also have to look at this because not only are we kind of looking at the pipeline as healthy, we've got a lot of students kind of coming in, we also have to look at who is coming in. So the gender composition, I think, is probably the most fascinating because women, again, accounted for about 3/4 of both the entrants and graduates. This number has been consistent for about the last 4 years. I don't see this as a trend. I don't see this as something that was kind of like a blip on the radar where the women came for a year and now they're like leaving. Nope, this is kind of your new director. The other interesting thing is incoming student diversity. When we look at our white new enrollees, we see that that actually last year was 57% of our enrollees. Hispanic new enrollees makes about 14%, and African American new enrollees about 20%. So what I really start to look at is if you look at the numbers even from 2023 to 2024, you see that the number of white enrollees slightly down, and that we're looking at like we're becoming less white, more Hispanic and African American. That actually trends exactly with the data of the census of this generation. So what we're seeing is reflected exactly in the actual national data. So who is going to school is exactly who we would expect to be going to school, a much more diverse population. I think this, when we're talking about specifically about gender and funeral service and looking at women, this really does start to mean we need to think differently about how we start to envision what funeral service looks like because it doesn't look the same. The number of times I've shared that statistic with just kind of people, and I go, we're graduating about 70%, 75% women. Most people's faces go, really? They are so surprised by that. And honestly, when you look around the classrooms right now, my campus classroom, I have 20 students. I just taught my last mortuary law class before coming out here. I have 20 students in my campus class, 19 of which are women, one man in that class. And I always joke with them. I said, your opinion really doesn't hold very much weight here, just so you know. Thankfully, he's a good sport about it, but that's really not different. And I think when you look at our online classes as well, which are even larger than our campus classes, that number is even higher. And I think that because of the flexibility of that modality allowing for online students, you're starting to see that number of women coming in even more. So that is your new graduate. Probably one of my most, I think, fascinating slides here, and probably, I think, one of the most important, and I think really starts to kind of change the direction of this conversation is that first kind of graphic right there. When we look at this, about 88%, 89% of students coming in have no connection to funeral service. That is shocking. I'm going to say that again. 11% of our students have family connection. 89 have no connection to funeral service whatsoever. That means that they have decided, mostly on their own, that funeral service is right for them. You can imagine from the academic standpoint what that kind of gap might actually look like. Because what they think funeral service is and the actuality of funeral service is wildly different. Most of the students that come into school, and again, I think what I love is that I really do get an opportunity to meet and work with all of our students. The students coming in really believe funeral service is about helping people, which it is. But I think a lot of them almost think it's kind of like almost therapeutic in a way, or kind of spending time with the grieving family in almost like, again, a therapeutic way, rather than kind of much more of the detail oriented work that has to get done in order for us to function. So I think there's a real misalignment of that. The other thing that I'm noticing is a lot of those students are coming in with preconceived notions as to what they have seen online. So, not the work that you are doing every day, not the work that my husband and I are doing at the funeral home, which are the late nights, the kind of running and scrambling and making sure everything is done and ready to go, but kind of the stuff that people have time to film. And I'm not here to talk about social media or what you see on that or anything like that, but I will tell you that I think what I would say about it is that if you've got time to really stylize and film something like that, you're probably not doing work at the level that some of us are doing it at. Because I don't know about you, I don't have a lot of time to kind of make sure that I can like don and doff my PPE while having like my video run and do that 4 times and make sure it looks really good to music. Are they great videos? Yes, they are. Are they fun? Yes, they are. But what that is showing is a reality of funeral service that our students are coming in thinking that's what we do. So we have a real gap in just experience when we think about that. Also, what I think that is what we've never said out loud is that when we have this kind of new generation coming in, a lot of those unspoken traditions, unspoken culture, unspoken ideas that we all just kind of understand are gone. So those classroom conversations that you had about what happened at the funeral home when you were there or this or that, they're not happening anymore because it doesn't exist. When you also think about it, only about 40% of our students have had jobs in funeral service in any capacity by the time they graduate. So that means about 60% of our students are graduating nationally with maybe never even really stepping foot in a funeral home. That should terrify you in some ways. Now, I know you're probably going, well, do you do anything about that? Or do you just go like, come on in, there you go, world? We do not. And I will say, there are 58 mortuary science programs, and every program can kind of run a little bit differently. I think that because I do have a funeral home, I am much more sensitive about that. So our students are all working at funeral homes in some capacity. Every single one of them has to work in funeral service prior to graduation. One of the things that we did is actually moved our first semester class. We now offer a cremation class. Every single student has to actually call a funeral home, which I will tell you is probably one of the most challenging assignments for them, because most of them would rather die than pick up a telephone. So to actually make that phone call and ask a question. Now, I will also tell you, it roots out a lot of people real fast. I also teach first semester. I teach business law, and I teach it so that like I can say, okay, how are we going to get from over here to a more real place? But our students are not used to answering the phone. Our students are not used to, doing the work that it takes attention to detail. So I think we have to really start to think more broadly about it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that I think is really important about this slide is that who our graduates are as far as age wise. You see two really distinct tracks here. About 52% of our students are 25 and under. So this idea that a lot of them are second career or are older, they're there, but they are not kind of the prevalent student that's coming in. You will see that about 20% of our students are 40 and older, and then that missing kind of 10% are even older, are 50 and older. So we've got about 30% of our workforce that's coming in at age 40 and over, and then we've got a majority that are coming in that are in that from 18 to 25. I'm going to point out something that I think is worth thinking about, because when you think about yourself between the ages of 18 and 25, think about that and coming into the workforce and what that looked like for you. I also now want you to think about that from like a young woman's perspective or anything like that. When we're looking at those ages, that's where a lot of people are making life decisions. They're thinking about family, they're thinking about marriage, they're thinking about where I'm going to settle down, they're thinking about all these different things. And that might look very different for each individual person, but they're thinking about those things. They're also starting to look at, does my partner make more money than me? If the answer is yes, guess where they're moving? With that partner, most likely. We see that more and more often, where it's like we have to look at even kind of things like compensation, and what that looks like is we value kind of our employees. So I think that what we kind of can look at these things and kind of take away for it is that recruitment now, which is excitement in a way, recruitment in a way can look beyond just kind of the funeral service households, right? You don't just have to make your own funeral director. So that's great, right? You don't have to go, I have a son or daughter, here we go, this is going to happen. That means there's a little bit more work that has to happen too. I also think that this means that orientation and socialization matter more than ever before, because they haven't grown up around that profession. I was just having a conversation earlier. I have two daughters. My daughters know that like when the phone rings, everybody gets quiet, right? That's just something that they've learned. I didn't have to say to them over and over again, and for a while we had like a ringtone, like if it was like a death call and it was birds, my youngest was like, who died? When she heard birds, she was like, who died? Who died? Right? Those are just things that happen because of the natural experience of like living in that world. Those weren't things that I had to stop and say, everybody be quiet, someone died. Right? There are moments, I will say, there are moments I do say that, but in reality, the idea here is that like when you grow up around that, or it's part of your kind of ethos, it grows with you. If that is gone, where does that happen? Where does that training happen? How do you start to instill those values that we take for granted because we kind of all understand them? That now has to come from two places. It has to come from the educators, which I assure you we really do work on those things. But we also have a really limited window of time with them. We also have a lot of practical work that has to get done as well too. We have to get them from point A to point B to understand like kind of a voluminous curriculum, and we have to help them pass the national board exam. Then also try to teach them communication skills and try to do all these different things simultaneously. Then they kind of come out into the workforce, a lot of them never having jobs before, not really understanding funeral service from a book versus real practice are also two very different things, because I can tell them until I'm blue in the face about getting up at 2 a.m. or having to do a removal or having to do all those different things, but it feels very differently when the phone actually rings, right? We can go through all those things. So it's happening at the academic level, but what's really kind of out there is that that has to start happening more in a much more kind of formal way at the funeral homes if we want to see that retention and that success of our future generation. I want to share one other thing kind of about the data that I find interesting is that attrition in funeral service is getting a little bit worse in funeral service. So if we look at kind of the number of overall withdrawals, we have 916 was in 2023, 1,000 in 2024. What I think is actually interesting is that what you're seeing is a shift from personal reasons to academic reasons. And I think this is really important because I think it speaks a little bit about kind of the nature of the new student coming in. And why I say this is that our programs haven't gotten easier or kind of been watered down or things like that. But I will say that the student coming in is a very different student than 10 years ago. And this isn't just at mortuary science colleges. This isn't just something that we're seeing. This is kind of nationally. I spend, as I told you, a lot of time doing research and kind of thinking about what is going on and how to best serve our student body. But when you start to look at nationally, when places like Harvard had to start a remedial math class because the students coming in did not meet the basic level of math that was always expected of Harvard students. When you see that at Stanford, 52% of all students now require some form of accommodation in terms of going to school at Stanford. When they looked at George Washington College, the school there was finding that the students couldn't actually read a book anymore. They were so used to reading passages and kind of being able to articulate from that that even to like sit down and give them an assignment to read an entire book, most of them were like panicked by that. I'm giving you those examples as kind of like these upper level colleges to start to show you that like this type of problem, you imagine that trickling down to kind of our associate degree level education that we are offering. We're having to kind of look at how do we educate this student in a completely new and different way as well too. Because what you experienced as students, even what I experienced as a student, is wildly different than what the student of today is able to do and kind of able to kind of look at. This does not mean that they are incapable or incompetent. And I want to be very clear about that. It does not mean that. It just means that for a lot of them, there's deficiencies that we have to work for to get them where they are because they've learned differently. My daughters don't have any real textbooks. Everything is on a Chromebook. Everything is in like little bits and pieces and they're putting it all together. They're learning, they're not that they can't do those things, but it's a very different style. Most of them don't even have homework anymore, which is also something when you start to look at that, that's a really big challenge to go from like no homework, kind of like, experience life. It's like kind of what they're talking about now to college, where I don't know if all of you sitting out there remember what that was like. It was not the fun time. I know it was fun, but like at the same time, there's a lot of work, right? So those expectations, we have to manage those for the students to make sure they can actually get through the program. So I think that's just an interesting thing when you're starting to look at this idea that they're not necessarily leaving because of personal reasons. We're seeing this more as an academic piece. So this also tells me that this means more opportunities for us to look at being able to intervene earlier for them. Also, this looks at a great place to add support in for those students as far as like before they leave. How does scheduling start to look for them? What does it look like when they are starting to struggle? So something to kind of think about. So our bottom line and kind of our takeaways, I think, from the data from these last couple of years is that, you know what, interest grew. That is wonderful. Our new enrollees and graduates increased in 2024. The female majority that held. So women continue to comprise that 3/4 of our entrants. Most of the entrants are not from funeral service families. These new professionals that are coming in are going to need socialization. I think that's the best way to kind of put it. Like if you don't do that, you're going to struggle with that employee. So understanding your role in that place really matters. And I think conversion is the challenge. And I'm not using conversion in the sense of kind of like a marketing term. What I'm looking at that is like we have to convert that interest into funeral service into sustainability, into kind of where they want to land and stay, right? So we have to take that enthusiasm and kind of like, this is what I want to do, and convert them into long term employees. So, how do we do that? To me, there's things we need to talk about. First, we have to talk about leadership pressure, we've got to talk about mentorship, and we also have to talk about retention. I want to start with this thought because I think if we can understand this, it grounds the rest of our conversation. And that is care for family starts with a culture that can sustain itself. If you can't care for your employees and yourself, the care that you are giving families is going to suffer. And that's the truth. If you can't kind of like create a place where everybody feels And I don't mean good as far as like everything is sunshine and rainbows, because that is not what I'm talking about. But building a culture of sustainability in your own funeral home, the care for your family is going to start to slip. Your numbers are going to start to slip. You're going to start to see kind of your loss of market share. That's important because if we don't see those connections there, you're not going to be able to put those things together. You're going to get frustrated about everything else that's happening. And most likely you're going to go, it's those new employees that are coming in. They are the problem. So, and guess what? They're part of the contributing factor of what's going on. So let's talk about that. I think that we for far too long have not actually addressed kind of how hard it is to be a leader, a manager, an owner, a supervisor. Um, to me, what you all have done, the ones sitting in this room, you have absorbed constant emotional, operational, and staffing pressures. And you've all had to do it with a smile on your face, right? You're the ones that don't actually get a break for the most part. You're the ones that have to keep going. And here's the thing. I think a lot of times we tell ourselves that we're doing a good job with that, right? That we're like, we're just going to keep carrying on. But that strain does not stay private. So what you start to see is that truly influences your communication, the morale, and the environment that the others are learning inside of. And that to me is one of those things, if we don't start to take that kind of reflexive stance, and again, this is not blame, this is a recognition that what you're carrying doesn't stay with you alone. When you're short with somebody, what do you think that is? When you're irritated with them, what do you think that is? That's your own burnout talking. That's your own kind of wall where you're like, I don't have time for this. Your irritability, all of those things. I mean, if you can tell, I'm speaking a little bit from experience, right? We've all been there before. This isn't a blame, this isn't a critique or anything like that. But when we start to see those inroads in ourselves, and then we start to snap at our employees, and we start to do those things, and when we start to let our standards slip, what do you think that's actually doing to the morale and the culture of the place in their business itself, and to those new professionals that you're bringing in? The other thing that I think is important is that mentorship is already happening. I think we talk a lot about this, and it's natural. When you bring somebody in, mentorship is already happening. But what I think we don't talk about is that your new professionals, they learn by watching. They're watching how you and your experienced people around you handle stress, handle conflict, and emotional demands. They're not just watching how you fill out the paperwork, right? They're watching you after you slam down that phone and go, God, right? Well, been there before, right? They're watching that. They're watching the comments that you make when that family leaves and you say, thank God that one's done, right? Or they're watching the way that you interact with each other. They're watching all of those little details. How you kind of operate and how you present everything to them, that's part of mentoring. So if you take a step back and think about, it's not so much that it is something where you sit down and go, I'm your mentor now. You will be my mentee. You will learn from me, right? That's not how that works. What it does happen is organically, when they're following you around, they're taking those mental notes because they're not only learning the tasks, they're also now having to learn from you what this profession feels like in practice. What does it actually feel like? This is where I start to see a lot of our students go, why am I doing this? The number of students that go out and are leaving within the first couple of years is staggering. We're at about 50%, and that's real. And I think it's not because you're terrible funeral directors. It's not that. I think that you're all really busy. I think that these things are happening, and then they are absorbing tone, pace, boundaries, and professionalism without any explanation. And when they're doing that, your silence or kind of like what they're seeing without any explanation or without any kind of like connection to that makes them go, uh-oh, I'm leaving. And a lot of times they don't even have a conversation with you about it. They just go. And they're not even just going to another funeral home. A lot of times they're leaving the profession entirely. So that to me is where we have this kind of like space and this kind of gap where we can actually do something. And that's what we're talking about with this type of mentorship. To me, burnout also typically shows up through communication. I like to think about it as burnout or compassion fatigue. You can really just like put your own word in there, because the other thing too that I think also is important is that for a lot of you that are sitting in here, a lot of owners, managers, leaders, you don't really have an opportunity to really take a break. Even when you go on a vacation or take that time, like a lot of you, like it's still going all the time. So there really is no off switch, and that can feel really overwhelming. That to me trickles out and trickles down to your employees and to kind of the experience that they have. And again, I think it's because it's the nature of how we run funeral service for a long time. So I look at this as burnout and compassion fatigue can surface as impatience, withdrawal, short responses, reduced presence, any of those things. That's what it starts to look like. How you start to see this in your employees. Do you have that employee that's showing up a few minutes late now? A little bit more disheveled, a little bit more like they weren't always together, missing tiny details, stuff like that that maybe they didn't do before? That's burnout for them. That's compassion fatigue. When you had that employee that was like wonderful and now just kind of like, meh, you're starting to see that kind of performance slip a little bit too. That's their burnout and compassion fatigue. This to me impacts and affects the families, the coworkers, and your newer employees. If we don't start to kind of address that and what that looks like and acknowledging what that actually is, like if you have someone that comes in and they look a little sloppy, what's our first thing that we do typically? What do we do? Who do we blame? That employee, right? Do we ask the question? Do we do anything else with that other than like, why do you look like that? You know better. Go get that suit pressed. Go do this, whatever it is. What is the underlying factor of why that is? They knew what time work started. They knew all of those things. So what got in the way? I'll tell you what it typically was is that enthusiasm, that like get up and go is starting to get up and go away. So we have to start to acknowledge those different things. And to me, we have to move beyond it because the issue is not whether the pressure exists. It does. You all know that it does. But we have to start to think about how does that pressure actually begin to shape other people's existence and their experience with you as their boss. And one of the things I look at that is like, how are you communicating with them? Are you taking a pause and just a moment to like think before you speak? That's been one of the like saving graces for myself is taking that one moment where I go, okay, I'm going to think about my response because that is one thing you always have the ability to control is your response to situations. If you take a moment and just 30 seconds, 10 seconds and just go, I'm going to think before I speak. And if you do that, that can move that type of communication from burnout, from like a tone, from all those different things into something that is relatable and under that someone can actually understand. That takes you $0. That takes you $0. It takes you a little bit of self-awareness, is what that is. To me, retention is actually shaped by the environment. This should not be surprising, but people actually want to stay in workplaces that feel clear, steady, and sustainable, right? It's not always about the money. What I'm finding more and more is that this younger generation would rather not have a job than have a job they don't like. And here's how I kind of describe this and think about it. Right now, about 36% of kind of, I would say like millennial and young Gen Z are living at home or are being financially supported in some way by their parents. Now, when you start to think about that, I'm an elder millennial, so I'm right on that cusp. I am like about as old as you can be to be still a millennial. But I will tell you that when I graduated from high school and then from college, I wasn't going home. Like it was kind of one of those things. Like if I went, like I would probably be more likely to be homeless at a bus stop than I would to go home and be like that. I would be admitting failure in some way. I am not going home. And by the way, I talk to my family every day, so I have a great relationship with them. But it was this mindset and mentality of like, I am not going home. Fast forward to this kind of upcoming generation, most of them still have bedrooms at their parents' homes that are like fully ready to go. And guess what? One phone call from that child. Now, I'm not talking about your employees, but I want you to think about your child. One phone call from your child, and they're like, Mom, Dad, what are you doing? Come home right now. I will cook whatever you want. I love you so much. Like, come in, come home. And that safety net exists for a lot of them. Because if you don't have the financial pressure, if you don't have to go, where am I going to live? Right? You don't necessarily have to stay in workplaces that you don't necessarily like. So there's a real difference that this younger generation doesn't have to experience. And I think that's something that's worthwhile because before, a lot of you experiences in this room was, well, I don't really have another choice. So I'm going to grin and bear it. I'm going to figure it out. I will figure out what my next steps are. This younger generation doesn't have that problem. They've got parents that really love them. So they're like, come on home. You don't need to take that. The other piece of that too is that when you don't have that financial pressure, a lot of my students have never written a check before, have never seen a check before, and have no idea what is going on in their bank account. And I'm not telling you that again because I think that they're incompetent or they're not teaching these things. It's not a conversation like that. It's the nature of banking of today. They don't know where money is coming and going. Mom and dad can throw $50 in there, 25, your paycheck goes in there. It's just a little pot of money. And the only question they ask is there money in that pot? Yes or no? Right? It's a very different kind of conversation. So I'm not here to tell you that that's wrong and like that we got to get back to those, like make them write checks. That's not normal. We're not going to do that. But what we have to do is start to understand that that's the experience that we're moving into, and how do we start to build in the traditions and the values that matter at the funeral home into kind of this experience. And that to me starts with you and starts with communication. And it starts with like, what are your non-negotiables? How do you work here? Because this is what I see. Again, if you want to keep your people and you want to start to build this and retain your employees, look, they don't need perfect leaders. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. You're going to make mistakes. That's life. But they need environments where stress is managed rather than passed down. I say it like this: people don't want to have to run around with a fire extinguisher. If you are treating your life like you are running with constantly with a fire extinguisher, you are going to burn everybody out. And that's real. That is not, and also it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't. That takes organization, it takes management, it takes leadership. And those are the hard things that actually have to happen. To me, I think the steadier workplace is going to be one of the strongest retention tools that a funeral home actually has. Where are those gaps and where can we kind of like start to see those expectation gaps? I think that where they really start to do is really from a misalignment of like expectations and reality. So to me, I find that those typically come in multiple places: schedule, pace, the emotional labor, feedback, and support. Those are the 5 areas where if you're like looking, where's the value add that I can find right away? Schedule, pace, emotional labor, feedback, and support. Because when expectations are unclear, their capability starts to move down. And look at this. These aren't actual personal failures. These are just like system issues. And what do I mean by that? Those means that all of those things that I've talked about, those 5 things that I just labeled for you, those can all be handled by communication and clarity. So when I talk about schedule, before you say to me, well, I don't know, like sometimes we have a very busy schedule and sometimes we have nothing. Yeah, no, I know that. That's perfectly fine. But that also means that like that person that you have working there, like what is their schedule? When do they get to go to the dentist? When do they go grocery shopping? What is their actual schedule? Just because you have decided to live 24/7, 7 days a week, does not mean that new employee wants to do that. And that's, I think, one of the biggest, harshest realities is that their name is not on the door and they are not interested in that right now. They actually want a schedule and they want to know when do they get to go home. And by the way, when they go home, they want to stay home. They don't want you calling and they don't want to like have a really interesting case to work on. They want to actually spend time with their families. They want to do bedtime. They want to be the softball coach. They want to do all those things. So the challenge then becomes, how do you build that into a sustainable workforce? One of the things that I've seen, and we actually started experimenting with at the funeral home, was because I started seeing this, and we're on the smaller side, so we were one of those places where one funeral director does everything, which I think many of you can probably understand. So it's kind of one funeral director does everything, one more funeral director, they also do everything. So between the two of you, you get everything done. What we were finding is that the younger generation, number one, they didn't like that because they felt very lonely. They also felt very unsupported in a way because it was like, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to train? How am I supposed to do all those things? And the old model was, well, figure it out, right? Because I'm over here doing XYZ. I'm not sitting there like, playing on my phone. I am doing work over here, but all this other work needs to get done. So that was a typical standard model at a lot of funeral homes. What I'm finding right now and what we've been doing at our funeral home is essentially breaking that one position into two. So they are not both making full-time salary, but they want a little less time, but they have sustainable schedules. They overlap with each other. So now I have two people essentially doing what one was doing before. And I've now kept those people for 3 years. Well, most places are like losing them. And what I've done with that is like look at their schedules and make sure, again, now they have someone to talk to. Now they have someone that can kind of build in like their its own type of leadership and management that's already built into that. And that might not work for your funeral home, but I'm just giving that as an example because we were very traditional where it was like all like 24/7, 7 days a week, we are all on call. Like that's what that looked like. And we realized very quickly we didn't want to live that way either. We have 2 daughters. We don't want to live that way. And guess what? Our new employees didn't want to either. So how do we figure out what that looks like? The emotional labor, I think, is as simple as like asking the question, like, how are you doing? I think far too long we get nervous about that question, so we don't actually ask it. We just are nervous that they're gonna like maybe cry or unload on us, and we're like, we don't have time for like a cry session because like I got a family coming in. So what does that look like? Making sure that we're actually asking that question. One of the things, I had a student call me once, and they were like, they were so shocked because they had a really tough week. I think in that week they had a death by suicide and then also a child death. And then they said to me, and this was so interesting, they said, it's just so strange that like we have to go to work the next day and nobody asked me anything. Now, I know you have to go to work the next day, but that missing piece was just having that little roundup of like, how are you doing? And just understanding that was something hard. That simple like question and check in can actually go a long way. I look at something as like onboarding is part of retention. You have to understand the difference between orientation and onboarding. Orientation tells people where things are. That's where the bathroom is. That's where Nancy works. That's where this happens. Onboarding actually tells them how to succeed. So to me, orientation introduces the workplace. Onboarding tells you how you're going to become part of it. So if you're doing orientation, great. I think all of you are doing that. But what does your onboarding actually look like? Onboarding gives clarity, it gives responsibility. Who does what here? And you can't just say everybody does everything, right? That might be in your brain what you think, but like imagine somebody new coming in and everybody does everything here. What is everything? What does that even mean? Something as simple as this. If you say to a new hire, go set up the room, go set up the arrangement room, or go set up the room for visitation, what's going to happen? You'll be wildly disappointed by the results. You will walk into that visitation room, you will look around and go, what did they teach you in mortuary school? How would you possibly think this is what I was thinking? Where would they have learned that? Where do they know what it looks like to set up a visitation at your funeral home? Is there a diagram? Did you walk them through it? Did you do it with them? Like, what does that look like? It's incredibly important. Those two things can actually be someone that you're building into a great new employee and new leader, or someone that you're absolutely cutting off at the knees. Because they're gonna go, I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna build a new employee that's like literally standing there in fear. If you have an employee that just stands there and stares at you and does nothing, most likely they're operating out of fear and anxiety versus clarity. Have those conversations. Um, it's not their job to decode your culture. It's not their job to figure out what it means to work there. It's your job to tell them what it means to work there and why they should want to. Those are the really important pieces for me. To me, onboarding looks like this. It doesn't have to be a big plan. It doesn't have to be like over the top. To me, if you can answer these 6 questions, you've got an onboarding program. What does success look like here? What am I expected to do now and what comes later? Who do I ask when I'm unsure? How is feedback given here? And that can be up to you, because that's the beauty of being a leader. You get to decide what the answers to these questions are, and then you have to do it. What are the emotional realities of this work? And what do I mean by that? This does not mean where it's like something where, where we just kind of brush that away or anything like that. This work is hard. It's really hard. So let's have that conversation. And also, what support exists when the work does become heavy? Because here's the thing, these questions actually matter because silence has consequences. When the answers are unclear, people fill in those gaps with the answers that you don't want. And they start deciding what it means to work at your funeral home, what it means to be involved in this. And that's where that confusion starts to actually become problematic. Mentorship should be treated, I think, as infrastructure. Mentorship is not extra, it's part of your operating system. So this means active guidance, realistic encouragement, honest feedback, and protection from preventable overwhelm. I'm going to say this very simply because I know I want to keep us on time and make sure that you have time for especially some coffee, because I know it's early and I've said a lot of numbers and a lot of data to you. But when I'm looking at this, when I'm actually talking about this, is realistic encouragement and honest feedback. You have 2 options. If you say nothing, They're going to interpret what that means, either positive or negative. And you need to control that tone. And there's a way to give honest feedback that can be constructive, that helps them grow as funeral directors. That is what you have to do. They are going to make mistakes. They are going to do things that you are going to say, that should be common sense, and it will not be. Anything that you think is common sense and obvious, I will tell you, is not. So as soon as you have a new employee, those are the things you need to spend the time on. And then also, like, realistic encouragement means acknowledging when they've done a good job. Hey, you tried really hard on that. It might not have went the way you thought it did, but I'm glad you stuck with it. Something as simple as that goes a long way, because what you're trying to do is you're actually trying to build, to me, I look at that as like that reservoir of, like, trust, because when that's empty, that's when they leave. But if you actually have something that's built up, your employees will stay because they believe in you, they believe in the message, and they believe in the work. The first year is where many of your risks actually concentrate. And I look at this. I think most of our directors, if we can keep them in about the 5 year mark, they're in. Like, I think that's kind of like anecdotally is where I've seen, is that that's kind of that. If they're by 7, you can almost say like, we've got you, we're good. But like that first 5 is probably the most tumultuous. The first year probably the most important now, because that year is now coming out from where they are coming from, a school where most likely they've had support networks and safety networks and all those different things. Like, oh, your assignment is a little bit late. Don't worry, we're here for you. Oh, you need to edit that. Okay, we're here for you. Like, all of those things like are built in. And again, don't get me wrong, we do have deadlines and we have like strict policies, all those things, but there's still a nurturing sense there. They move from that into, what does that environment look like with you? Is it ambiguous? And I think that's the biggest one. I don't think many funeral homes are like, I'm going to be a super toxic environment and I'm going to make anybody that comes in here miserable and I can't wait. Like, I know that's not how most of you operate, but I think that ambiguity, that like where you're going like, do I need to answer this question? Like, what am I supposed to say here? Like, your own kind of ambiguity is what causes a lot of the issues. To me, overexposure, when someone is working a lot, because you will have those weeks where everybody is needed and you do work a lot. Do you have a conversation about that? You say thank you for that. Hey, take a day off. Like, what does that look like in balance at your funeral home? Inconsistent supervision. Are you like, go figure that out, come get me if you need me? How many of you are a come get me if you need me? That is not supervision. That happens when they are well on their way to understanding the tasks in your funeral home. Come get me when you need me, right? I assure you, most of your new employees will be exactly where you left them. They'll be looking at the exact same task. They'll be looking at it going like, well, I didn't know like what to do or like where to start. And I was like, so I figured I'd just like wait till you got back and then we could like do it together. Right. So if you're seeing that and experiencing that, which from the laughs, I feel like you have, because I've been there too, that's inconsistent supervision. You're thinking you're giving autonomy. Your wings fly from the nest, child, go. You're not. You're actually kind of making it so that they are not going to be successful. Toxic communication, what do I look at that as? Like, are you passive aggressive? Are you actually giving like real feedback? And also just a lack of development. Training and development does not mean that you are training for them to leave you. I think a lot of times we get nervous that if we give like professional development, if we want them to work on their skills, that they will then leave you and go somewhere else. That is not necessarily the case. We've got just a couple more here to kind of close out here. So what can you do now? Small changes can actually create large cultural retention gains. Here are some just basic things that you can put together. Build a 90-day onboarding plan. What does that mean? That means, where should they be when they start? What's your check-in point? And what does success look like? It can be something as simple as, you're answering the phone a lot better. Break down the tasks. Break it down so you actually understand and they understand. Start to assign your mentors intentionally. If it's just you at the funeral home, okay, you did it, you assigned it, that's it. But now you need to become a better mentor. If you have good people in those places, make sure they're kind of like aligned with the job task, and that they know that they're supposed to be a mentor, and that they're supposed to be mentoring this new person. Um, Create structured check-ins after hard things. That to me is one of the biggest things. We started this new program at the college that's been really successful, and it's to me, it's about what do you do after like a hard case or something like that, because we talk a lot about at the school about kind of like the restoration, right? Like the putting the pieces back together of the gunshot wounds and all those different things, and those are wildly important. But we don't ever talk about like what happens after. How do you start to build back after that when you've handled those cases and what that looks like? That's a real gap in our education, but that's coming out right to you, and we're working on that. But it's not even anything really formalized. Clarify your expectations, and then also train your supervisors to lead with steadiness, not just their experience. Um, and finally, here's kind of my closing messages for you. The future of funeral service, it's exciting. It really is. Like, I get up and I'm excited to work with the students. I'm excited about my job. It depends not only on who enters, but on who they encounter once they arrive. That's important. And if the profession wants to keep the next generation, you have to be intentional about your culture, about your leadership, about your onboarding and mentorship, because retention is not accidental, it is built. And I think I'd like to leave you with this idea that preparation happens in school and retention is actually decided in practice. That, my friends, is my time here. I have been so excited to be here. I will actually be here. I have a booth here as well too, and I'm happy to have any questions, concerns, comments, anything like that. That's probably one of my favorite things to do is to troubleshoot with you all about what you're seeing in real life and how to kind of navigate that. But with that, thank you all so very much.